Okay, well, thanks again, Jay. David Ray Griffin gave me a kind jest. He said it's an excellent example of old-fashioned metaphysics, and then he put in parentheses, that's not a slam, but a compliment. So I thought that was kind. Well, thank you, everyone. Yeah, I have prepared a 25 or so, 30-minute perhaps presentation. I'd love to, if we need to end a little early, to get some questions in Jay and have some dialogue with you as well. And this is the publication of my dissertation, which is excellent to have it happen so quickly. I must apologize for the price. You will have to spend your life savings if you want to have it in person. Lexington, it's their custom to pay or to charge $100. Although having said that, I will say, although it's expensive, some of the insights, I think at least, are priceless. So there's my pitch. This is looking at some of the bold points, some of the structure, and some of the main conclusions. We have to obviously avoid some of the details, but I do hope you'll consider picking up the book and giving it a read. Well, so to begin, I'd like to draw everyone's attention then to the quote at the top of the screen here. The task of philosophy, Whitehead states, is the understanding of the interfusion of modes of existence. I love this term, interfusion. Okay, so this book is an investigation into the nature of ultimacy and explanation, particularly as it relates to the status of and the relationship between mind, value, and the cosmos. Now that's a loaded sentence. In fact, it's the first sentence of the introduction to the book, and it's worthwhile to break it down just a little bit. So in using this term ultimacy, I'm referring to that mode of inquiry which would pursue that which is ultimate or necessary in the philosophical sense of that term. Okay, those ineradicable conditions, those presuppositions, those requirements without which arguably nothing at all could exist. Now that's a large claim. It seems there must in some way be conditions of this type, and part of the philosophical tradition has been engaging in this type of discussion. In using the term explanation, I'm referring to this related mode of inquiry also, which looks to how such ultimate conditions, okay, assuming we can identify them, are ultimately explanatory, not simply of any and all things, but also in and for each other. And the statement in and for each other is important. It's a relational statement. Therefore, for this work, a quest for ultimacy and explanation is not simply concerned with grasping something of those ultimate conditions that ground existence, but also understanding how it is they relate to one another, how it is they fit together in a sort of collective constitution of ultimate coherence. That's the way I put it in the trailer video. So, of course, this is not a simple task, but the emphasis does remain on the relational nature of ultimacy. And there's different ways we can put that it's not simply a matter of pointing to one thing or reality or condition as ultimate, or even to many of them. In fact, Whitehead tells us that there's an unending number of ultimate notions. But the focus is on the way in which they're interdependent and mutually supportive. Okay, another way of putting it would be that the concern is not simply for the singularity of ultimacy or the plurality of it, but perhaps more so the ultimately relational nature of these ultimate notions. And the basic claim that emerges from this sort of introductory comments is that to find oneself, considering the relational nature of ultimacy, okay, in this kind of way, is to move towards affirming nothing short of the ultimacy of relationality. So this is the framework I'm working with. Now, of course, the philosophical tradition has given no shortage of wild metaphysical proposals in trying to endeavor these types of questions. And arguably, I think one of the most long-standing, one of the most far-reaching traditions is what I've called the Axia Noetic tradition. And this term, Axia Noetic, comes from two Greek words, axia meaning value or worth, and noetikos meaning mind or mental activity. And although diverse, this tradition insists variously that something, and perhaps even someone, ultimately mind-like and of immeasurable value, necessarily conditions the possibility, character, and reason for all existence. What is more, it's claimed in this tradition that this reality itself is necessarily conditioned by these ultimate notions and even is exemplary of them. So in different ways, from Plato to Aristotle to Plotinus to Anselm Aquinas and to great thinkers in the modern philosophical tradition up to Whitehead, and in our current time, both Keith Ward and John Leslie, who are still with us, they're exemplars in different ways of what I'm calling the Axia Noetic tradition. The issue, of course, is that it's not always been clear in this tradition how mind and value relate, and what place God or the cosmos, God and the cosmos, actually have with respect to them. So the book proceeds under this assumption that more should be said about the relationship between mind, value, and the cosmos on both divine and human levels. And arguably more should be said about other related axionoetic notions as well. So what are some of these other notions? Well, we mentioned mind and value. There's possibility, a wonderful question of possibility. There's actuality. For Whitehead, certainly there's creativity. There's God, and there's the world. And one might even fold God and the world into these other notions in some respects. Right? These are fundamental notions for conceiving of God and the world. And the question we're asking is, how are we to conceive their relationality to one another, particularly in light of certain issues or challenges that arise when one of them is isolated and appealed to as ultimate? So how are they related? What does mind give to value and value to mind? What does possibility give to actuality and actuality to possibility? What does creativity give to God and world? And what do God and world give to creativity? And what does God give to the world? And what does the world give to God? It's a way of thinking about the relationality, the entanglement of these ultimate notions as I'm framing the book. Well, we have to have an entry point into this discussion. And one way of limiting that entry point is through a triangulation of sources. Now, these are figures I hope you all would recognize. Certainly, Whitehead is the preeminent figure of modern process relational philosophy. Some of you, I'm sure, will also be familiar with Keith Ward, the British idealist philosopher who, for a number of years, has promoted idealism and personal idealism at that, as the view that at the foundations of the universe is a dependent relation of the world on an infinite divine mind, such that mind is the ultimate category. I expect most of you are perhaps not familiar as much with John Leslie, who is a British-Canadian philosopher, who for a number of years has put forth his vision of axiarchism. This is a term he introduced in the 70s, and what it means is the reign of Platonic value in the universe. And he makes this robust and amazing claim that there are ethical requirements or needs of an abstract character that themselves are creatively responsible for the existence of any and all things, including a divine mind. It's a fantastic and challenging claim. And so these three figures help to limit the discussion. And I'll say just something more about the relationship. One reason to bring them together is it's not been done before, and that's helpful, at least in not any extensive sort of way. Keith Ward, for example, is greatly influenced by Whitehead. He praises his metaphysical system of creativity of value being of extreme novelty when it comes to the philosophical tradition, although he's going to push back at certain points philosophically and theologically. Although Ward does not dislike the language of being labeled a process thinker. Now, Ward's also looked to Leslie positively. Ward says, if you're looking to a solution and or reason potentially for these kind of ultimate questions, value is, an axiological explanation is the correct direction to look. Now, Leslie also points to Whitehead as an extreme or a premier axiarchist, again, one who affirms the reign of Platonic value in the universe. He also looks to Ward as being an ally when it comes to affirming the place of both value and mind. Okay, both Ward and Leslie have these wonderful places for ultimate value and ultimate mind, although they get there from different ends. Okay, we won't go over too many details. So these are the triangulation of sources. Now, having said that, my emphasis and focus is on Whitehead when it comes to his insights. So more than any other philosopher, Whitehead, I'm convinced, has stressed nothing short of the ultimacy of relationality. Okay, And what this it means is he's pointed to a way in which ultimate notions live through each other in the ways that they each grant each other the factors necessary for existence in a way. They're each granting each other life. And he calls this, throughout his works, he calls this relationship mutual immanence. But it's also that of mutual transcendence in terms of the functions that these multiple notions play for each other, but not for themselves, this relationship of mutual immanence and transcendence. I only put independent inseparability here as another way of phrasing it. It's not in the book that way, but it dawned on me while filming the trailer video, so I thought I would use it, a relationship of independent inseparability. So the claim then is that mutual immanence as a Whiteheadian intuition, as this ultimate mode of relationality, can help illuminate some of the most stimulating and challenging questions that emerge from considerations into ultimacy and explanation. Okay, those of mind and value, those of possibility and actuality, and those of God and the world. So if these are all sort of prefatory comments, we can then look briefly into the basic structure of the book. Again, we'll have to avoid a lot of details that are important. But there's 4 sections, each of which looks to a key mystery, as I understand it, of existence. And the first section looks to the mystery of any and all existence. I wonder if you've ever asked why there is something at all. Many people dismiss the question. Philosophers have dismissed it. Philosophers have loved it. I think I'm in good company in asking and enjoying asking this question. So part 1 looks to different distinctions and layers and dimensions and asking these types of questions, these ultimate questions. It also looks at what are the kind of solutions that have been offered throughout the tradition. And it has attention certainly to value and mind respectively, because this is the focus. So I use a variety of thinkers to do this, but I pay attention in particular to the work of Whitehead, Ward, and Leslie in looking at these different ways of parsing out ultimate questions. The ontological question, close to nothing. Questions, the cosmological question, a question of a cosmological order. Okay, tedious and stubborn questions of nothingness and necessity. Questions of contingency, novelty, evolution, beginnings. And suffice it to say here that in going through these weeds of distinctions, in light of the work of Whitehead, Ward, and Leslie, we find that facing the realism, in some sense, of Platonic axiological realities seems utterly inescapable. Now, we'd have to follow a rabbit trail to argue that out, but we proceed on that claim, at least for the presentation this morning. Now, if that's the case, that affects how we approach a solution to these kinds of questions. And I'd like to point everybody to The Mystery of Existence. This is by Robert Lawrence Kuhn and John Leslie. It is a fantastic edited volume in which they lay out a sort of 5-fold typology of kinds of solutions that have been put forth with respect to these questions. So one would be that there had to be something, that a blank is absurd. 2 would be there's no explanation needed. Okay, the fact that there's something is a brute fact. 3, that chance or perhaps quantum probability is responsible for why there is something. Another would be Platonic value as ultimate, and 5, divine mind as ultimate. Now, the problem with this typology, of course, and Leslie and Kuhn realize this, as it's presented as if these are isolated kinds of solution. So one question that needs to be raised is whether or not a relational solution provides more insight. Okay, might the mystery, for example, of God, the universe, and existence find solution in a kind of relationality among ultimate notions rather than one or the other? I do think this is a distinct answer, a robust answer to the mystery of things that should be investigated in a creative way, and focusing on the relationship between mind and value, as well as the other notions we mentioned, is one way of doing this. So it should be said as well that the depths, the theological depths of the philosophical tradition have on the whole affirmed the reign of both value and mind. But again, this relationship has not been parsed out in ways that are totally clear. Now maybe that's an absurd request because we're dealing at such large metaphysical heights. But I see Whitehead, Ward, and Leslie as a part of this Axia Noetic tradition and as lending insights and thinking about the relationship among these ultimate kind of notions. So then, if part one is about the mystery of any and all existence, part two looks to the mystery of necessary divine existence. And what it does is consider the ways in which this Axia-Noetic tradition can be read through respective priorities. For example, of abstract value as conditioning, concrete divine mentality, or concrete or actual divine mentality as conditioning abstract value. We raise the question, in light of the promptings of our sources, as to how value and mind might reciprocally relate in God, such that challenges about divine necessity are illuminated in a new way. Again, this is no normal task. This is something that philosophers and theologians throughout the ages have been concerned with. So in a way, I am reinvigorating, Jay, I sort of like that term, some of these questions. Briefly, chapter 3 looks at Leslie's axiarchism. Okay? He reads the entire tradition, consistently pushing back to the abstract supremacy of value. Okay? He says, necessarily, eternally, there can be creative, ethical requirements for the existence of various things, needs for them to exist. We sort of have to appreciate the challenging nature of this, that there are abstract needs and requirements that themselves, without any aid from anything else, are creatively effective in procuring the totality of things, including divine things. It's a fantastic claim. Of course, the challenge is, well, how can these needs or requirements exist? Where do they find their place in the soil of one's ontology, or are they just free-floating kind of realities? That would be one challenge. Another would be, well, how can they do anything? Presumably what it means to be abstract is to be causally inert. 2 + 2, for example, equals 4, but that fact by itself has never put $4 in your pocket. Are abstract value requirements any different from this? Now, with that in mind, chapter 4 looks towards idealism. Whereas Leslie moves from the abstract priority of value, Ward moves from the concrete or actual priority of mind. Okay, he says the deepest reality is mind, eternal and necessary mind. And the challenge that's been put forth to Ward and to others who affirm something like a divine mentality in their worldview is, well, what explains or reasons the divine mind? What is the nature of divine necessity? Okay, some have said logic, some have said power, some have said there is nothing, that God's existence is a brute fact and with no explanation. Well, Ward doesn't agree with that. In fact, he looks to value as grounding the reality of God, but he does it from the perspective of concrete mind. The only context in which value makes sense is from actual or concrete mentality. Whereas Leslie says the only context in which the existence of a divine mind makes sense is from the perspective of abstract value. So there's two tiers, two poles, if you want, between Leslie and Ward that I see being reconciled in an interesting way through Whitehead's relationalism. Okay, Whitehead says, one of my favorite statements, the key to metaphysics is the doctrine of mutual immanence, each side lending to the other a factor necessary for its reality. So I think this can be applied to the insights and priorities of Ward and Leslie, and what the solution would emerge in terms of this discussion would be that abstract value lends to mind a coherent axiological reason or explanation, while actual mind lends to value a framework of creative mediation. Only in the mutual immanence of value and mind for each other are we led in, perhaps, to the mystery of something of the necessary existence of the divine. Now, I admit that it takes much, or some at least, translation into Whiteheadian categories, but I do argue it's there. Whitehead, as most of you will know, does insist upon the primordial mind of God, and he insists that the universe has a side which is mental and permanent. Okay, he insists also that God's existence is founded in value. The divine nature, he states, is founded on ideals of perfection, moral, and aesthetic. What could that mean? Okay, what is more, he insists that value conditions all ultimate explanations, that all ultimate reasons are in terms of an aim at value. Well, the question must be raised, is this even the case for the explanation of God? What does it mean to say God's existence is founded in value? Well, I think Leslie offers us a way of understanding, and both the two poles in Leslie and Ward can be reconciled, if you want, in this mode of relationship. Now, Whitehead doesn't say it this way, but I think his relational intuitions come out in the statement here by A.C. Ewing, who was an idealist philosopher in the 20th century. It would be as true to say that the value principle could not be true without God existing, as to say that God could not exist without the value principle being true. Now, those of you who are familiar with Whitehead will think immediately of statements at the end of Process and Reality, where he says, it's as true to say that the world is immanent in God, that God is in the world. He has a series of statements. Now, Whitehead doesn't say this, but I think you can utilize the relational intuitions as filtered through Ewing's comment to say it's a consistent way of peering in to the mutual immanence and transcendence of mind and value in God, where value eternally obtains the existence of mind, while mind eternally conditions the creative reach of value. Only in the mutual immanence of both do we have a larger, perhaps, sense of understanding the mystery of divine necessity. I'm not claiming to have solved the mystery of divine necessity, simply peeled back a veil into the relationality of the divine life. If part one looks at the mystery of any and all existence, and part two, the mystery of necessary divine existence, part three looks at the mystery of possibility, one of the most fantastic questions and problems of philosophy, I think. Okay, so we look at key riddles of possibility, okay, in terms of their ontological status. What are possibilities? Where are they? How do we conceive their relevance to actuality? In some sense, we're living into the possible at every moment. We look to challenges to these riddles. Perhaps there's ways of avoiding looking to, pardon my phone here, through these challenges. And thus, we also have to be pushed all the way, and Leslie does this, to the question as to how possibility and relate in God. What is the status of God's own possibility? So in looking at these riddles of the possible in chapter 6, Whitehead, Ward, and Leslie each parse out these riddles differently. They have different priorities. For each of them, possibility does pose ontological challenges, which find some manner of resolution through recourse to both value and mind. And this is both on a finite level of actual occasions for Whitehead, and also on a divine level, where God too is an actual entity. Now, perhaps all of that is mistaken. Perhaps possible challenges surrounding possibility are really misled. So we look at three examples of challenges to these riddles, and these come from W.V. Quine, Frederick Ferre, and David Lewis, each of which try to rid us of the riddles possibilities pose. And yet we critique them through Whitehead, Ward, and Leslie, and critique them based upon their rejection of any ultimate standing of mind and value in the universe. So if the problems of possibility remain, then we look to the viability of the mutual immanence of possibility and actuality. Okay, that Whitehead's relationship, again, in this regard, can help resolve these issues, the issues of possibility in the universe, and potentially even, humbly, the riddle of God's own possibility, such that God's possibility and actuality require each other in mutual immanence. Now, one challenge we face comes from Leslie. Okay, he says there is at least one very obvious case of a Platonic reality which is necessary as a prerequisite to the existence of any divine being, and which cannot itself in any way depend upon the actuality of such a being, namely the reality of the logical possibility of there being such a being. It's a loaded sentence. Leslie is consistently wanting to push back to the abstract ultimacy of value. And he says God is actual. If God is actual, God is possible, and that possibility cannot in any way depend upon God, pushing back to the abstract ultimacy of value and possibility. And yet for Whitehead, it's not so clear. Whitehead points to a relationship a requiring relationship, saying, what is the meaning of actuality conceived as extreme contrast to potentiality? He answers, we recur to the statement, actuality and potentiality require each other. But is this the case with God and God's own possibility? Well, he says God does not create eternal possibilities, For the divine nature requires them in the same degree that they require the divine nature. Put differently, perhaps, God is the primordial exemplification of the mutual immanence of possibility and actuality. Again, it takes some translation, it takes some creative thinking about the ontological principle of, I'm sorry, I must assume some of you know a bit about Whitehead's philosophy, so that's my beheading sin, perhaps. But Ward, too, I include him just to say that he is taking a similar type of approach to Whitehead. God does not create, or does not decide which possibilities to create. All possibilities are specified completely by the uncreated being of God. If then part one looks to the mystery of any and all existence, and part two to the mystery of necessary divine existence, and part three to the mystery of possibility, it's only natural that part four looks to the mystery of actuality, the world as actual. So we look into the actuality of the world in terms of these different perspectives of Whitehead, Ward, and Leslie. Okay, that includes its status, its character, its constituents, how it becomes actual from or in relation to divine mentality, and what challenges this may create, and how these might be addressed through a mutually immanent understanding of the God-world relationship. So chapter 9, and I'll just say this briefly, looks to mind in the making of actuality. Now, both Keith Ward and John Leslie make an interesting claim, and it is this, that divine thought, divine thinking alone is itself what makes for actuality. And they have different emphasis, though. Okay, Leslie, for example, his pantheism insists that intricate divine thinking is being. In other words, when the divine mind thinks through the total structure of a universe and all of its intricate detail, including yourself, there is no difference between that thinking and the reality of that which is thought in actuality. And he calls this pantheism, I think rightly, because there is an identity between divine thinking and the world. There is no difference. Now, Ward refers to his vision as panentheism. We would call it a relational panentheism, where he says divine thinking is what makes for being, is what makes for actuality. But by virtue of being actual, the world is other than divine thinking. So he wants to preserve an otherness between God and the world. And we problematize these in various ways, but suffice it to say for now, the challenge we can offer surrounds the status and value of otherness. Here is Leslie with his axiarchism saying value is in control in the universe in some deep way. And yet he may not truly allow for it as long as the value of collaboration, of ultimate reciprocity between God and the world, between two others, is preserved, is not preserved, rather. It seems to me that's what he is denying in this pantheistic understanding. Now, Ward allows for that. He insists upon otherness between God and the world precisely because otherness preserves the supreme value of collaboration and love. He's operating from the Christian tradition, love between God and the world. But even for Ward, this is a contingent phenomenon. So I argue, based upon the parsing out of Ward and Leslie, that the mutual immanence of God and the world, as Whitehead understands it, is the perspective that preserves primordially the value of otherness and the value of collaborative relationship. And so one way to parse Whitehead out again is to use trans-pantheism as a way of designating his position. This is a term that has been designated by Roland Faber in years past. And it affirms both the mutual immanence and transcendence of God and the world for each other. Whitehead often is called a panentheist. I think that's a fine label for Whitehead. But because of the complexities of that discussion, of demarcating that position from others, I think transpantheism is a helpful way in the context of this project to distinguish Whitehead. So it's only in Whitehead that divine thought does not actualize, divine thought alone is not what's needed to actualize the world, right? God does not and cannot actualize the world through this divine thinking alone. Rather, the world adds something to God. The world actualizes divine thought through its own self-creativity. They put differently, the world requires God for its very possibility, and God requires the world for the actualization of divine value. So this relational solution, if you want, preserves the supreme value of relational otherness as exemplified primordially in the God-world relationship. Whitehead tells us it's as true to say that the world is immanent in God as that God is immanent in the world. It is as true to say that God transcends the world as that the world transcends God. And further, I won't read this one because we're running low on time, but that metaphysics requires the union of God and the world. So where have we been, and where is the book in quotes? Briefly, see if you can hold on to the relational intuitions of some of these as we conclude in the next minute here. Leslie, necessarily, eternally, there can be ethical requirements for the existence of things, needs for them to exist. Ward, the deepest reality is mind, eternal and necessary mind. Whitehead, the key to metaphysics is the doctrine of mutual immanence, each side lending to the other a factor necessary for its reality. In light of this, Ewing says, it would be true to say that the value principle could not be true without God existing, to say that God could not exist without the value principle being true. What about applied to possibility? God does not create eternal possibilities, for the divine nature requires them in the same degree that they require the divine nature. What about to the world? It is as true to say that God transcends the world as that the world transcends God. It is as true to say that God creates the world as that the world creates God. Thus, the task, Whitehead reminds us of philosophy, is the understanding of the interfusion of modes of existence. To conclude, as I've conceived it in this book, mind lends to value what value cannot lend itself, just as value lends to mind what mind cannot lend itself. In so doing, mind and value live through each other in mutual immanence and transcendence. So too, possibility lends to actuality what actuality cannot lend itself, just as actuality lends to possibility what possibility cannot lend itself. In so doing, possibility and actuality live through each other in mutual immanence and transcendence. So too with God and the world. God lends to the world what the world cannot lend itself, just as the world lends to God what God cannot lend God's self. In so doing, God and the world live through each other in mutual immanence and transcendence. And finally, it's in consideration of the relational nature of ultimacy in this kind of way that I'm willing to affirm that relationality, that a mode of entanglement between ultimate notions is what is ultimate. And the rest, as far as I can see, is silence. I don't know what else to say about it. So I know we're running out of time, and Jay, I want to let you jump in. I'd love to fuel other questions if possible, if possible. And I'm going to stop the share. But thank you, everyone. I hope to have not lost all of you in this task.
Hey, Andrew, thanks so much. And I've got 37 questions for you.
Oh.
And so, no, I'm kidding. I do have some questions, but I really think that in the interest of time, it would be better if other people jumped in, and we can talk at another time, or if there's a little time at the end, I'll ask them. So let's just say, who would like to jump in? Any question is a good question. Bob.
Hi, Andrew. I've always disagreed with Whitehead's very Platonic view of eternal objects, and consequently, I should say, not been persuaded by his idea of the existence of God. But listening to you is extremely helpful in helping me propose this idea. What if we define possibility as, in a very process way, note, what can happen given the actual past? Now, what can happen, except Whitehead's distinction between real and relevant, there are all kinds of things that couldn't happen without going through, trillions of years of modifications, building on the past, but allowing for that. What about defining possibility as what can eventually happen given the actual past? That would certainly change the conversation that you're proposing, it seems to me. And I would be very interested in your response to that thought, which occurred to me as I listened to you.
Well, thank you. Yes, that's a great question. And of course, I'm familiar with your work throughout the years. it seems to me that Donald Crosby makes the same move and same proposal. And it seems to me that he's collapsing the distinction Whitehead makes between a real possibility that is dependent upon what the past has given, and pure possibility, in a sense, unhindered kind of possibility as such. And I think the question would be whether we can collapse those, or whether or not there is whether or not pure possibility itself is necessarily assumed in making any claim about real possibility. So that's a larger discussion. I'm happy to discuss that with you too, but I haven't been convinced that possibility can be easily avoided, and that possibilities are necessarily valuated. And I think Whitehead would say this, and I think one must say this in some sense, even if God is not in the picture, although I think God belongs in the picture. So that's a great question, though. Perhaps we can chat further.
Thanks for sparking the idea in my mind.
Thank you.
Anybody else like to ask a question or make a comment at this moment? Al.
Yeah, you refer to value. I guess my question is, what value?
Are you asking how do we define value?
Yeah, I mean, there can be all kinds of values, so is this a good value? Is this a value that aims towards love, and why would it?
Right. Well, I suppose if it didn't, it'd be hard to claim it as a value in some sense. But I'll work from the perspective of Leslie, where he defines value as an ethical requirement. He says there are needs for certain states that themselves could be infinitely better than not existing, or infinitely better than their complete opposite. He makes incredible statements about the existence of worlds of unalloyed misery being infinitely worse than there not being any world at all. He's making an objective claim about the reality of some states as being better and worse. And Whitehead also speaks in terms of this vocabulary, that better and worse are ultimate notions entertained in human experience. So I fully admit that human experience is value-laden. That doesn't mean we precisely know which values are ultimately worth pursuing. Cultures disagree, but that there is a distinction between value and disvalue, I think, is a presupposition of our existence. But it's a great question, and a difficult one, certainly.
Well, it seems kind of circular that they are choosing a value to determine a value.
I see what you mean. Think in terms of a need, an indefatigable ought. There's an ought in the nature of things, a way things ought to be. He's making the claim that that ought itself is enough to procure what is needed. And if that's the case, that filters into our life. It means something for the way we live and treat the environment and treat all things. But yeah, that's a great question. So we've moved from Bob Mesley's question of possibility to your question of value. This is precisely the complexities of the discussion.
Thanks. I suggest that we have one more comment or question from anyone, and then I'd like to ask John Cobb to offer his own response. So anybody besides John want to say something at this moment? Ask a question, raise a comment.
This discussion of relationality sets off all kinds of Trinitarian bells ringing in my consciousness, and I haven't read your book, so I don't know if you make that connection or even an allusion to it. And I say this as a Unitarian, so
yeah, sure.
It seems to me that in many ways the old patristic fathers were struggling to articulate some kind of immanent relationality in some of the ways that resonate with what you've done.
Absolutely.
Hey, Andrew, let me jump in real quickly. I just realized we have some other guests coming in for the second hour that are counting on that time. So If you could just offer a very brief response here, and then I want John to speak. And by the way, it seems to me we can have a follow-up to this. The Cobb Institute can figure out a way to have a follow-up where we have time to really pursue these matters, and we can so do. So with that in mind, John, if you would say a word, and then I think we need to bring this hour to a close.
Looks like you're on silent there, John.
Unmute, John.
I would say that we have heard a discussion and a speech that is the sort of thing that for at least the last century has been systematically discouraged in our culture. There was a time when this kind of discussion, I don't mean the specifics of it, but were very widespread. And it happens that my introduction to Whitehead was by a metaphysician, Charles Hartshorne. And I had the very interesting experience of once telling him about my interest in cosmology, and he had no interest in cosmology. So there is a real difference between metaphysics and cosmology. And I had the experience after I was introduced to Whitehead by a metaphysician of moving to the divinity school, which was totally focused upon radical empiricism. And I came to the conclusion that Whitehead is the greatest metaphysician of recent times. He's also the greatest radical empiricist of recent times, but that his major interest was cosmology. That's what he calls his major book. And so I am very fascinated by being back into a context where the metaphysical questions are being discussed and are taken seriously. And I just want to thank Andrew. I hope you understand that you're hearing someone who is very original. I don't know what help he got along the way, but he is creating a set of answers to questions that are very, very rarely asked in our society. And I just want to say, even if I don't in every case, I wrote him and said I was a little bit afraid that when he talked about mind, it would be understood too substantively, and that would be un-Whiteheadian. But I mean, these are discussions we could have. They have nothing to do with whether this is worth listening to and it's important. So it's, he convinced me that Whitehead takes metaphysics much more seriously and gives much more emphasis to it than I had been thinking. And I just want to thank you, Andrew, for bringing me back to where I started with process thought, not in the specifics, but in the issue of what is absolutely necessary. That's sort of how we can think of the metaphysical. So thank you.
Well, thank you, John. And Jay, I know you need to go. Thank you, everyone. Please reach out to me if you need to on my website or at the Center for Process Studies. Be happy to continue the discussion.